Right, welcome everyone to this edition of the Zahra Institute speaker series. I'm Matthew Abdul Haq Niyami. I'm an instructor of critical Muslim studies at Zahra Institute, and I have the pleasure of introducing today our speaker, Ramazan Aras, who will be speaking on Kemalist Colonial Modernity, Kurdish Self, and the Notion of Tawhid, and a bit about his background. He's a professor of anthropology and sociology at the Department of Sociology at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. He is also the founding director of Center for Oral History and Social Memory Studies at Ibn Khaldun. Previously, he worked at the departments of anthropology at both Western University in Canada and Mardin Artuklu University in Turkey. And he's the author of many titles, including the most recently, Anthropology and Sociology of Emotions, which I want to pick your brain about that later. Theoretical and ethnographic perspectives from Turkey and beyond. And then most recently is the Palestine and the Future of Global Affairs, Power, Language, and Colonialism. Is that out? Is that available, Dr. Aras?
Yeah.
That's out. Throughout 2025. Okay, awesome. And his main research areas are social theory, anthropology of state, anthropology of emotions, senses, memory, social trauma, body, place, borders and borderlands, migration, oral history, sociology, and anthropology of secularism and Islam. So as we go forward with the topic for today, applying his as he puts his disciplines to work on the subject of the Kurds under Kemalism. If you have any thoughts, questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat. And then at the end, I'll kind of synthesize them, and we'll try to get a good Q&A system a session going. If you'd like to, speak your question verbally, go ahead and raise your hand near the end, and we'll try to pull you up. Without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ramzan Aras.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew, for this good introduction. It's a very great honor and pleasure for me to be with you today. And thank you very much for invitation by the Zahra Institute. I'm very glad and very excited to be here and talking about this critical issues in this critical time period, not only in Turkey and in the region, but also globally. Let me first of all share my uh, PowerPoint, and then I will start. Oops. Okay. So, Bismillah. The title, of course, as you see, the Kemalist Colonial Modernity, the Kurdish Self, and the Notion of Tawhid. In today's presentation, I want to document and talk about how the self is shaped and constructed under the shadow of internal colonial modernist dynamics that are employed by the hegemonic nation state regimes in Muslim countries towards other ethnic Muslim communities that are coping with state sponsored severe assimilation and secularization policies. The secular and modernist regulations and tools of the modern nation state that are borrowed from colonialist Western powers have been imposed by force on these Muslim communities who can be defined as internally colonized communities. Here, I claim that the Kemalist modernization can be redefined as another form of colonial modernity, to quote Walter Mignolo and Annibal Equiano and Enrico Dussel, which resulted in internal colonization of Kurds as a Muslim and ethnic subject in Turkey. For these reasons, the possibility of resistance and recovery of the Kurdish self requires a process of what Du Bois called double consciousness. To what extent the idea of the self as an ethno-religious subject can be emancipated from these epistemic and ontological occupations. Here, I aim to contribute to the labor of decolonization of discourses on the other and otherization mechanisms by highlighting the importance of the notion of Tawhid as an epistemic and ontological recovering idea at both subjective and collective levels. Here, I examine the historical trajectory of the Kurdish experience through the lens of internal colonialism, to echo also in the Turkish context Ismail Beşikçi, specifically analyzing how the Kemalist colonial modernization project functioned as a systematic mechanism of cultural and linguistic erasure. By imposing secular reforms and mandatory Turkish nationalism, the state sought to dismantle Kurdish identity, utilizing education and militarization as tools to facilitate a deep psychological alienation within the population. To encounter this colonial legacy, I propose a decolonization of the mind rooted in the Islamic principle of Tawhid, reframing monotheism as a liberative framework for social and political equality. Ultimately, I argue that this spiritual doctrine can dismantle the social shift, what to echo also here Ali Shariati, of hierarchy and oppression, offering a path toward the emancipation of the oppressed and the restoration of the human dignity. In today's presentation, my presentation is composed of three phases. In the first part, I will talk about and try to explain Kemalist colonial modernity and how it was implemented and performed by the state and its diverse apparatuses. I will scrutinize the process of foundation of modern Turkish state with a particular focus on the single-party regime era, which was based on the authoritarian secular national sovereignty. In the second part, I will talk about how these denial and assimilation policies have severely shaped and traumatized the Kurdish self as an ontological entity. In the final part of my presentation, in the third phase, I want to talk about decolonization of self and mind, healing, emancipation, and reconciliation by employing the Islamic notion of Tawhid. So here we start to the PowerPoint. Just to move. I'm not able to move on, I guess. Oh, okay. So, of course, in my theoretical articulations, I was also in touch with certain theoretical works. And I think the connection between the notion of the internal colonialism and colonial modernity is a long discussion, of course, to investigate maybe further in another event or in another work. But here I want to specifically mention these works and those that I also mentioned in the first part of my presentation as inspiring works in my analysis and the ways in which I try to understand the whole phenomenon. So in the phase one, if we look at the Kemalist colonial modernity and as a phenomenon and as a historical process, we can redefine modernization process in Turkey as another form of internal colonialism. And of course, when we look at this historical process, in particular focus on single-party regime era, which covers 1920s, 1930s, 40s, and early 50s, I would say, we come up with certain critical events in this period that one by one needs to be mentioned and thought about it. The first one is, of course, secular politics. As some of you might be familiar with, during the single-party regime era, of course, secularism, authoritarian secularism was one of the main aspects of the new modern nation state. And through diverse secular politics, different impositions, epistemic and ontological impositions were made, of course, in that process. So to mention some of them, of course, the abolition of the Khilafat was one of those historical events that created not only an epistemic rupture, but also an emotional rupture within the society. The second one was, of course, the prohibition of the Arabic alphabet. If we look at the alphabet change and transformation, this is one of another rupture in the post-Ottoman period, in the new modern Turkish state, where abolition of the Arabic alphabet and reimposition of the Latin alphabet create a huge rupture within the society. And of course, we are here not only talking about the Kurdish case in general. When we look at the whole country, this rupture in terms of the alphabet created a huge gap and disconnection from the past, where created an epistemic departure also from this Islamic history and Islamic tradition. The other point is centralization of the schooling. Of course, as you know, the closure of the tekkas and madrasas was also another breaking point during the single party regime era, which traumatized the large portion of the society, which were too much institutionalized and ingrained within the system. So it wasn't only an institutional rupture, but also it was again an epistemic rupture and delinking the Islamic the Muslim population from their historical past. And of course, as a part of the Kemalist modernization process, linguistic unity was another principle that they were trying to employ, and they employed, of course. And in the linguistic unity framework, any languages rather than Turkish were prohibited. So it wasn't only in this period prohibition of a Kurdish language, it was also other ethnic languages that were spoken in the post-empire Anatolian territories. And of course, the other very traumatic, I would say, historical breaking point was the head law and the dress codes that were also by force implemented and enforced on the society, which again created another rupture within the society. So if when we think about all of this secular impositions and the secular politics, it wasn't only the Kurdish society, but also the Turkish society and other ethnic communities were too much traumatized within this framework. And of course, in the context of the head law and other dress codes and the prohibition of the languages, we see a systematic dehumanization of the Islamic tradition. So in this context, I just to mention one of the projects that I have conducted some years ago. We conducted an oral history project in 26 cities all around the country, where we interviewed elders from above the age of 75 to 114. We had some interlocutors at that age. And we collected around 200 stories from that generation, first, second, and third generation, I would say. And even in this, the findings of this project also reveals the ways in which how the secular politics not only traumatized the Kurdish society, but also in the same time traumatized the rest of the society, and in particular focus the Turkish society as well. So to continue, in this period, in particular focus, the single party regime era, the Kurdish majority regions were and have always been the prime target of the modernization and the westernization project. And of course, some of you also are familiar with the conceptualization that the Kurdish trauma, or the Kurdish majority regions that were under the severe and violent secular politics were not only affected in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of their religiosity. So the Kurdish body in that context was targeted not only from the ethnic let's say, identity, but also religious identity. So the Kemalist modernization, which can be also equated with Westernization, which is one of the readings of the studies in modernization of Turkey in general, where modernization is too much associated and equated with Westernization. And this process is too much militarized, as we can say. And of course, in this process, the state military and ideological apparatuses were in the wider scene were employed to perform the state power and sovereignty. And of course, when you look at the different forms of the modernization within the Kemalist regime during the single party regime era, most of them actually can be seen, and how to what extent they can be resonating the colonial practices that we can see in other parts of the world. So in this context, I want to talk about colonial domination of the Kurdish body and the eradication of the Kurdish self. And in this process, we can talk about different aspects of Kemalist colonial modernity, but I have a particular focus on certain themes. And in the following part of my presentation, I will try to get deeper insight to them. And one of the first, when we look at the Kemalist modernization process, there are certain episodes that we encounter, and in their relationality, in their colonial domination in relation to the Kurdish body and the Kurdish self and the Kurdish society, the first striking point can be defined the denial of the Kurdish identity, especially when you look at the 1920s. The first reaction of the Kemalist bureaucratic elites and political leaders was a complete denial of the Kurdishness as an ethnic identity. So, and as a replacement, the literature is too much ingrained and dominated by this stated discourse to define Kurds as mountain Turks. So, in the first reaction and in the first steps of the social engineering process, I would say, denial of the Kurdish ethnicity and identity and redefinition of it as a mountain Turks, which in Turkish is named as Dağ Türkleri. The second point that I want to highlight here is the hegemony of official historiography and denial of the Kurdish history. So in this context also, in one of the famous, I would say, practices of one of the famous practices of the colonial modernization is denial of the history of the subjugated societies and communities. So in this context, so it wasn't denial of the Kurdish ethnicity and identity, but in the same time, the Kurds themselves were not seen as an epistemic and ontological also entity. So in that context, the Kurdish history and memory was also a part of this denial. And of course, in this context, the Kenyan famous post-colonial thinker Thiongo talks about how, in the context of historiography, how recreated official historiography is imposed, and during which how the history of the indigenous communities are denied and rejected or certain way assimilated. So in that context, the Kurds were not seen as an entity, but also not seen an entity with a history. So in that context, oral history and the local history and the memory of the Kurdish society, on the other hand, in spite of the denial, can be seen as one of the site of the resistance, on the other hand, underground, that maintained its authenticity and continued until today. And of course, during the colonial domination, we see too much militarization of the Kurdish inhabited areas, Kurdish territories. And of course, when you look at the historical framework, one of the first incidences, of course, is the Sheikh Zayed rebellion, which happened in 1925. And of course, after that, we see the Dersim rebellion, and then we have the Aru rebellions, etc. So, in this process of social engineering project and the transformation of the country through a violent, authoritarian, secular, and Turkish nationalist policies, the Kurdish territories and the Kurdish society was too much militarized and terrorized in this sense. So, and this militarization of the region through violent suffocation of the Kurdish voices and opposition resulted, of course, too much executions, massacres, and other violent events, unfortunately. And of course, in this period, public executions were one of the strategic Kemalist, tactic or strategy to disseminate the emotion of the fear as one of the powerful performance of the state power. So the public executions, I am going to share some pictures with you in the following slide, were systematically performed, particularly in 1926, in 1927, during the after the initiation of the İstiklal Mahkemeleri, independence tribunals. And in that period, it wasn't only, again, the Kurdish population as a target, but also the whole opposition or the whole society was targeted. Anyone who wasn't willing to accept the Kemalist main principles, which are associated with the severe authoritarian secular implementations. And of course, public executions was not about governing the emotions or dissemination of the fear within the society, but also it was a strategy of the state to perform those executions in the public spaces, in the city centers, as a way of disciplining and punishing, of course. The other point that I want to mention as a part of this cultural, as a colonial domination of the Kurdish body as an epistemic and ontological entity, is too much associated also with the cultural and economic subordination. And of course, this is something that is too much emphasized in the studies on colonial modernity, because colonialism and the colonial apparatus is not only targeting the other as an racialized category, but also subjugation and subordination is administered and coordinated within the cultural, economic, and other settings. And of course, in this context, we can say that the Kemalist colonial modernity has severely targeted in that period the cultural and economic foundations and institutions within the Kurdish society. And of course, in this period, we see administrative mechanisms like the central government and the local apparatuses as one of the powerful controlling mechanisms, which also facilitated the ground for assimilation by any means necessary. And of course, here we need to remember deportations, and deportations were widespread during the single party regime era, particularly after the Sheikh Zayed rebellion in 1925, and also during and after Dersim massacre, and also in other episodes as well. So deportations and demographic engineering was one of the critical aspects of the Kemalist colonial modernity, where the Kurds were depopulated from certain areas and resettled, particularly in the western part of the country, by aiming to facilitate the assimilation process, of course. And of course, executions and incarcerations, again, in this period are very critical in terms of understanding the the legacy of the colonial modernity and how the colonial power is terrorizing not only through the physical mechanisms of discipline and punishing, but also the emotional, the cultural, the economic mechanisms as well. In short, the Kemalist, I want to conclude this part by saying that the Kemalist, modernist, Western Turkish nationalist narratives with uh, with a combination of Eurocentric thoughts, which can be defined as secular, positivist, evolutionist, and Orientalist, were employed um, were employed to eradicate all epistemic and ontological foundations of the Kurdish society. So overall, when you look at the state practices in this period in particular focus, secularism, positivism, the idea of evolutionism, and the Orientalism are main, like I would say, main pillars of this intervention, I would say, towards the Kurdish society. And of course, as a result of this domination, the destruction was not only happening within the epistemic foundation of the Kurdish society, but also within the ontological foundations as well. To move on, in the next part of my presentation, I want to again give some more details about this period, especially when we look at the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and early 50s. The Kemalist colonial modernity is too much based on the notion of the denial, repression, and a racialized civilizational discourse. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the 1920s, the main position of the colonial domination was to complete denial of the Kurds. So the Kurds do not exist. What we are encountering from the point of the Kemalist colonial project was the Mountain Turks, Dağ Türkleri. And in this period, when we look at the official discourses of not only representatives of Republican People Party, but also top leadership, even in that period, we see certain, and even the media in that period, which Cumhuriyet Gazetesi is one of the good cases. If you are interested, you can look at the issues, especially that were published in 1926, in 1927, which were in Ottoman Turkish, by the way, because the shift, the prohibition of the Arabic alphabet and the implementation of Latin alphabet was made in 1928. So until that period, Cumhuriyet was in Ottoman Turkish. Even in the discourses, in the newspapers, in the media, and the state representatives were too much combined in certain ways. And one of those critical notions that was too much highlighted in relation to the Kurdish question in that period is primitiveness. So this is something that we too much encounter in the process of not only colonization but also in the process of decoloniality. So the other as a primitive entity that needs to be civilized, and the other notion that also Mesut Yeğen in his famous work highlights is tribal. You know, the Kurd as an entity which is associated with a tribal affinity or tribal structure. And the third one is reactionary adjective that is too much associated with Kurds and with the Kurdishness. So primitive, tribal, reactionary, and uncivilized, these are like four, I would say, main adjectives that were too much used in the description and definition of the Kurds in the political discourses and in the official discourses in that period. So, in that context, when you look at the Kurds, Kurdish identity or the Kurdish self from the state, from the Kemalist colonial domination perspective, it was something that needs to be either erased, completely destroyed, or by any means necessary, or if not assimilated. So these were two main policies that were generated towards Kurds in that period, in the early republic. But in the later periods, we see, especially in the 30s and 40s, we see a new move within the Kemalist colonial modernist project that is a little bit shifting to civilizing and the disciplining mechanism. So I am going to give you some critical examples later. So in that period, Kemalist colonial modernization project is in their relationality with the Kurdish population is too much obsessed with the civilization, civilizing and disciplining the Kurdish self. And of course, this Kemalist colonial modernity was not something that we can observe and document just specifically in the single party regime era. That legacy of the single party regime era continued, of course, in the later periods. And so in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, we see continuities and discontinuities in the Kemalist colonial modernization project, of course. And even today, we can still observe ongoing legacies of that past, not only in the discourses, but also in the practices towards Kurds in Turkey. So,
Star, you are currently muted.
okay. Is it okay now? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. How long I was muted?
Just for a second or two. That's not too long.
Okay. So one of the examples that I want to give you in order to highlight my framework more clearly, especially for the international audience in the room now, is this critical example of one of the Minister of Justice during the single party regime era, whose name is Mahmoud Esad Bozkurt. And in one of his public speech, he states that my opinion, my conviction is that this country itself is Turkish. Those who are not pure Turkish have only one right in the Turkish homeland, and that is to be a servant, to be a slave. So this statement about non-Turkish populations with a particular focus, of course, the Kurdish population, highlights the ways in which how the Kemalist colonial modernization process actually was, through its discourses, how much it was feared and how much it was resonating the colonial projects and performances in other parts of the world. So here I want to a little bit talk about different performances during the single party regime era and how Kemalist colonial modernity has implemented and used colonial like violence as one of its powerful tool. And of course, when here I talk about violence, of course, I'm not talking about physical only violence. I'm talking about different forms of the violence, which can be extended to symbolic, psychological, emotional, economic, cultural, etc., etc. As you see here in these pictures, these are the pictures on the top and the one on the left side. this one and this one and this one are from pictures that were shot after the Dersim massacre in 1937 and then 1938. And even the documentation of the Dersim rebellion through pictures very clearly documents and show us the ways in which the Kurdish body is treated and seen by the Kemalist colonial authorities. So even when you look at those pictures, you know, the ways in which, and of course on the picture on the right bottom, you see the public executions were very common scene, particularly in the 1920, 1925, 1926, 1927, and of course in other periods. Public executions, chaining, dragging the bodies has been one of the critical practices of modern Turkish state, actually. So I would say these scenes were not only the scenes that can be observed and documented for the 20s and 30s and 40s. These scenes also can be seen, especially in the 1990s, when the conflict were too much intensified between the PKK and the Turkish military forces. So public executions for the modern Turkish nation state and as also a colonial practice is too much common and is too much visible in modern Turkish history. And of course, all of these are very much, data to analyze in the context of disciplining and punishment. So, disciplining and punishment as two critical colonial tools have been also very powerful tools for during the Kemalist colonial modernization project. Also, since early years of the Republic, disciplining and punishment in the context of the Kurdish case has been two powerful tools. And of course, here I'm talking about different forms of disciplining and different forms of punishment towards the Kurdish body and the Kurdish self in order to create this obedient citizen, or what is called quote unquote makbul vatandaş. In this slide, I want to also talk about Kemalist colonial modernity and its civilizing mission. And of course, there are a lot of examples to talk about and to analyze, but I just want to give you some specific ones that at least some of my favorite ones. And here you see Sıdıka Avar, the woman with the sunglasses riding the horse on the top. And of course, this is her famous book. I'm not sure whether still it is available in Turkey, but I'm sure you can see it republished, or you can see it in the libraries. And it's a very these Dağ Çiçeklerim, My Mountain Flowers, are memoirs of Sıdıka Avar. So who is Sıdıka Avar? She was the director of the Elazığ Girls Institute between 1939 and until 1959. And Elazığ Girls Institute, what we call in Turkish Elazığ Kız Enstitüsü, was founded after the massacre of Dersim, where in the previous slide you have seen pictures of the children, and most of them are orphans whose parents were massacred during the bombings of the Sabiha Gökçen and other military initiatives in the region in 1937-38. Sıdıka Avar was a teacher in Istanbul who also worked sometime in the American College in Izmir. She was invited by Mustafa Kemal to found this institute in Elazığ earlier in order to with the civilizing mission, in order to educate and have a schooling for the not only orphans who were left behind after the massacre of Dersim, but also other kids in the region. And in that project, particularly girls were targeted and tried to be dragged into the school. And of course, as you can see, this practice is too much resonating Canadian residential schools. As you know, I studied in Canada, and I am too much. I was too much involved in the history of the indigenous communities in Canada, but residential schools was one of the interesting topic that I was always trying to learn more and more. And here, even in this pictures, even you can see the similarity and resonance between the pictures. But of course, this is not a coincidence, as you also will see. This before and after pictures that are too much seen in the colonized world were also very cliche constructions in the education and schooling system in Turkey also, particularly during the single party regime era, but also in the later period. So, and when you look at the civilizing mission of the Kemalist colonial modernity, here, of course, you can see that how language and the culture is too much targeted, and how through the project linguistic and cultural transformation is aimed and desired to be achieved by using different education apparatuses and institutions. And of course, one of the main aim, of course, in this process also was to remove children from their cultural environments and to facilitate state-led transformation. I don't know how much you are familiar with the residential schools case in Canadian residential schools case, but just to give a little short synopsis, in that historical past, native kids, indigenous kids from age of 6 to 12 by force and sometimes by kidnapping were taken and put in these schools which were under the control of the religious institutions like the church, where indigenous kids were forced to convert to Christianity, but in the same time, those in the British territories were assimilated to British culture, and those in the Quebec region were also forced to be assimilated to French culture. So the trauma and the legacy of the residential schools in that period is a long history, of course. I don't want to go into that direction. I have to move on quickly. But the social, the cultural, the political, the psychological implications are very close and very similar in that context, which maybe in the Q&A session, we might come back and talk about some more details here. And of course, through the civilizing mission, where education and schooling were two powerful apparatuses that were implemented, the Kurdish self as an epistemic and ontological entity was too much targeted, and through which creation of an assimilated, Turkified, loyal citizens was desired, of course. And of course, just slightly, I just want to show you some headlines of the newspapers during the single party regime era, where, as you can see, Kurdish language was violently targeted, and anyone who wasn't speaking Turkish were incarcerated or punished in different ways. So if you look at the magazines and newspapers in that period, you can see too much data and documentation about diverse politics in that period. So now I want to move to the phase two in my presentation. So talking about all this colonial modernist, Kemalist colonial modernist foundation and its performances, its practices by implementation of diverse politics from secularism to Turkish nationalism, what happened on the other side? So this is the part that we talk about the state, the colonial interventions and modernization project and how it was implemented. It was like a short summary of a long history. So what happened on the other side, like the Kurdish Self and under the Kemalist colonial modernity? So one of the points that I want to highlight here is so I don't want to go, I already talked about the physical violence and terror and other issues, but here I want to talk about the psychological impacts on the Kurdish self, on the Kurdish body. So the question of who am I is one of the critical questions that needs to be answered. So due to the severe Turkification policies towards the Kurdish self and the Kurdish body, we see a deep and bigger trauma within the Kurdish society, where you are not allowed to claim your identity, where you are not allowed to claim your ethnicity, where you are not allowed to claim your culture, where you are not allowed to claim your epistemic and ontological foundations. So in that period, even today, I would say that legacy is one way or another continuing. You are Turkish in the public, but you are Kurdish at home. So this dilemma and not being able to answer and claim who you are publicly and openly created this psychological duality, I would say, in the Kurdish body. So this is something that what Du Bois talk about double consciousness. So this is something that the Kurdish self was completely under the hegemony of the colonial modernist project, where claiming who you are was pushed to the ground. So here I want to talk about also a critical point. I am not here talking about a complete success of domination or a complete passivity of the Kurdish self. I am trying to talk about the colonial modernist aspects of the Turkish Kemalist modernization project without ignoring different sides of resistance in this period, of course. I don't want to be taken wrong in that sense, but resistance was more so on the underground and try to survive and cope with and deal with different aspects of the Kemalist colonial modernity in different parts of the Kurdish region, of course. One of the other point that I want to highlight here is inferiority complex. So the colonial domination, as you are also familiar with, created this superiority-inferiority dilemma. So in that context, Turkishness and through the Turkification process was too much imposed on the Kurdish society, where the Kurdish self trapped into the inferiority complex. So here we need to also echo Fanon's discourse on inferiority complex and in his analysis of black man and white man and black woman and white woman and all these complications that Fanon is eloquently addressing and talking about. Personally, in my analysis also, I am claiming that in the Kurdish self, there is a ground of inferiority complex that has been created through the colonial subjugation in the Kurdish body. So not only in the past, but also in the present, in the large, if you look at the general frame of the Kurdish body and the Kurdish self, you will see a powerful ground of the inferiority complex in different ways, in different multiplicities, in their relationality with the Turkish state and the Turkishness and all other state and institutional foundations. And of course, the colonial modernist domination created a form of alienation also within the Kurdish society. So we can, in the larger context, we can talk about a huge portion of the Kurdish population that have been alienated And in this alienation, the self is not recognized. In the larger part of the Kurdish society, there is a huge portion of the population that is not able to speak the language, that is not familiar with their culture, that are not familiar with their history, and that they are not familiar with their memory and the past. So, in that sense, Kemalist colonial modernity has created this ground of alienation also, which can be also observed and documented in today as well. The process is, of course, continuing. And of course, the other point that I want to highlight here also the notion of self-orientalism. As you see, as you also are able to see, the definition of the description of the Kurds, the projection on the Kurds was too much made through the Orientalist frameworks also. So the Orientalist Kemalist discourses were too much powerful, not only within the curriculums, not only within the education system, not only within the state discourses, it was ingrained and within the structure. So in that sense, we can talk about a structural discrimination and Orientalist discourse within the system. So under the shadow and under the influence of such formation, self-Orientalism is a very observable practice among the Kurds, not only in the past, but also in the present. So this is again reminding us Du Bois' double consciousness to see, so it is not only to see yourself who you are, but also to see yourself through the eyes of the Kemalist discourse and the Kemalist narrative. So in that sense, which is again too much self-Orientalism is too much connected to inferiority complex and the notion of alienation and inability to respond to the question of who am I? And of course, the point that I mentioned earlier is the linguistic impact. The prohibition of the Kurdish language and the violent assimilation throughout the Kemalist colonial modernization project created a ground and gap between the Kurdish population and their familiarity with their language. So in today's context, for instance, a huge portion of the Kurdish population is not able to speak the language. So, and even speaking the language is through the self-orientalist framework is seen even like as something inferior even. In today's context, even this is something very powerful that can be observed not only in the western part of Turkey, but also in different cities, in different, even in the like of far places and towns and villages in the Kurdish region as well, unfortunately. And of course, cultural impacts and economic impacts are two other major issues that need to be addressed, but I think I don't have that much time to go into that direction as well. I have to be quick as far as I see my timing. Matthew didn't tell me how much, actually you told me like 45 minutes, but I am already, I think, crossing the limit. Let me quickly come to my the phase 3, where I want to talk about the notion of Tawhid as a tool for decolonization. So after talking about the impact of the Kemalist colonial modernization through epistemic foundations, through ontological foundations, and after addressing all of cultural, social, economic, political, and historical aspects of coloniality, here I have a certain form of proposal by echoing Ali Shariati's notion of Tawhid and many other Muslim scholars and the ways in which they articulate the notion of Tawhid as a theological proposition that claims a liberative praxis. And I am coming with this idea of notion of Tawhid in a point that not to fell into trap of also an ethnic nationalistic standpoint also. I believe that, of course, that the notion of Tawhid is one of the powerful tool for decolonization that can create a ground for a liberative praxis. And of course, Du Bois' double consciousness as another theoretical articulation and formulation allows us that to the ways in which Kemalist colonial modernity had epistemic and ontological distractions on the Kurdish body, on the Kurdish self, and how double consciousness can allow us, the Kurdish subject to reclaim themselves and to return to themselves and to acknowledge who they are. And of course, this is, of course, requiring a social, a political, an historical, a psychological challenge with the Kemalist colonial legacy, of course. Here, and of course, I want to talk about decolonization of the mind issue because under the influence of Orientalist Kemalist discourses, under the influence of different aspects of the Kemalist colonial modernity, to what extent we can talk about a liberation, to what extent we can talk about a form of emancipation. And of course, here I want to also mention positivistic, evolutionist, Eurocentric, nationalistic framework of the Kemalist colonial modernity, where it is too much imitative version of the Western colonial framework, of course. Under such destruction, to what extent we can talk about an emancipatory framework. So here, I believe and I think, of course, claiming of the ontological dignity in the context of the Kurdish self and the claim of the Kurdish identity. And of course, here, by echoing Ali Shariati's articulations on insan as Ashrafi Mahlukat, in his discourses, Shariati is too much emphasizing this notion of insan as an Ashrafi Mahlukat in relation to also capitalist, modernist, and Marxist frameworks, which is too much grounded in the history of slavery, colonialism, Orientalism, etc. So we are coming to a point where how is that possible to challenge the different forms of the colonial articulations and the colonial destructions? What is so when we look at the different theoreticians in the context of decoloniality and decolonization, of course, different scholars are coming up with different propositions. But here, I think in the context of the Kurdish case, the notion of Tawhid is one of the critical standpoint that can help us as a liberative praxis to deal with not only the trauma of the Kemalist colonial modernization, but also as a tool to empower the Kurdish self in relation to that history. So here I claim that Tawhid as an ontological foundation can encounter also the notion of the inferiority complex, alienation as two critical standpoints of the colonial modernity. Here, to remember Frantz Fanon's propositions in relation to freeing the black man out of the inferiority complex and alienation in relation to the white man, Fanon is inviting us to violence in another way, as a kind of violence as an emancipatory tool against inferiority complex and alienation under the white supremacist foundation. But here, I think the notion of Tawhid, uh, which is based on the unity of mankind, which claims the ontological dignity of every single human being, creates this egalitarian framework that, as an inclusive register, that not only Muslim subjectivity can be incorporated into, but the whole humanity can be incorporated into that foundation. Of course, Tawhid is not only as a theological also foundation. It is not only a doctrine that is based on a religious or theological framework. It also reorganized, as Ali Shariati claims, also social, political, and economic foundations. And of course, the notion of Tawhid creates a ground where the inferiority and superiority dilemma, or the division of the people into rich or poor, or master or slave, or white and black, or man and woman, they are all even seen to again echo Ali Shariati's and his notion of social shirk, can be seen one of the liberative praxis to deal with the colonial hierarchies, which can be very powerfully documented and observed during the Kemalist colonial modernization project and its relation with the Kurdish body and the Kurdish self. So here I want to re-emphasize that the notion of Tawhid as an egalitarian framework can be an emancipatory tool, not only for Muslims, but for all humans, which can provide a universal basis to create an alternative epistemic and ontological foundation, which can deal with and engage with the colonial legacies, not only in the Kurdish context, but in the global context. So we are living in a critical time period in today's context, where we are talking about social theory, we are talking about different streams of politics that are going on in today's context. So Western academia and in large context, the academic body at the global level is stuck somewhere where talking about human rights, talking about ethics, talking about emancipatory frameworks, talking about decoloniality has become something more and more difficult. So in such a context, in such a historical period also, what is the alternative? So going beyond Kemalist colonial modernization project and other practices in other parts of the world, what is our intellectual position in such a historical context? To what extent we can provide an alternative paradigm, to what extent we can come up with an alternative vocabulary where coloniality cannot be remanufactured, or Eurocentric frameworks cannot be remanufactured one way or another in the so-called critical perspective. So I think I want to conclude here, but I want to end with this critical task that Kemalist colonial modernity, as one of the practices in the larger picture of the colonization and coloniality in the global context, can also teach us and allow us, through the Kurdish case, that to what extent we can talk about non-Western modernities, or to what extent we can talk about modernity without any connection on relationality with the coloniality, or to what extent we can talk about decoloniality. What are the main tools and apparatuses that we can employ and implement in our labor of and the task of decolonization or decoloniality? So I want to end here and open the floor for comments and questions, hopefully from your side. And I hope so far I have been able to explain and clarify my points throughout my presentation. This is a project that I have been dealing with actually for a long time, and I am trying to crystallize and too much deepen and of course sharpen certain aspects within my arguments. And I hope it has been enough provocative for you and for other audiences to think about Kemalist colonial modernity and the notion of the Kurdish self, the implications, the destruction, and the alternative healing mechanisms that can be employed one way or another for a better future. Here, of course, my proposition is too much centered around the notion of Tawhid, which claims equity and unity among the humanity and mankind, which of course it's a longer discussion with its theological aspirations as well. I am stopping here, and I hope the Q&A session will allow us to elaborate more on diverse aspects and points here.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Aras. Thank you for taking us through that tour of this period in history. And we've got a lot of good questions here. Since we just left off with the Tawhid, one of the members of the audience was asking. First I should note that if anyone wanted to review anything from this presentation, it will be the recording will be posted on the Zahra Institute Facebook pages, and so it can be reviewed there for further reference if you missed anything or you want to just share it with folks. And then yes, and then to the questions. So yeah, a couple people were asking for clarification on Tawhid. How do you imagine this being, I guess, implemented? And how would it be implemented in a way that you mentioned unity of humanity. So is this for non-Muslims and Muslims, amongst Kurds and Turks, etc., amongst anyone who would be using this framework? And then I guess to throw my own little thing onto this as well is that, like you mentioned, the divided mind, or whatever, what was the phrase? The divided of Dubois.
Double consciousness.
The double consciousness. Sorry. Yes, the
Yeah.
double consciousness. So I can, like, Tawhid, one could, see Tawhid, oneness, as like maybe a conceptual antidote to that problem, or a way of looking at that problem. I guess, but there seems to be this other aspect of the whole internal colonization process, which is not so much an issue of fragmentation, but of almost like reduction or essentialism, simplification. These things like the self-orientalism. If I understand you correctly, it's sort of a self-simplification and caricature of oneself, perhaps. So how would Tawhid sort of interact with that concept? And yeah, who would be using this in such a way that it can include anyone?
Okay. So first of all, we need to clarify the ground of the notion of Tawhid, which is based on the unity of mankind. And of course, the notion of Tawhid in Islamic, framework, completely denies all these dichotomic, foundations that can be traced not only in the Western history but also in the Islamic history. The notion of the slavery, the notion of slave and master, inferior, superior, man and woman. So the notion of Tawhid centralizes the notion of the insan as an ashrafi mahlukat. So without any class, without any ethnicity, without any racial categorization. The notion of Tawhid as an Islamic proposal is eliminating all of the binary categories based on evolutionist, positivist frameworks. So, in that sense, it creates this egalitarian, a kind of classless society where all humans, uh, one by one, live together. So, in that sense, the notion of Tawhid is a challenge to all this dichotomic relationality in the world history also. And of course, here I want to emphasize that this is not something that we are talking about in our relationship with the colonialism or the Western history or this. We are talking about this, the lack of the notion of Tawhid within the Islamic foundations, also within the Muslim majority countries as well. So it is. We are talking about a history which is too much founded and based on this um, Western Eurocentric colonial history, not only in Europe but also in the colonized world and in the third part, the other parts of the world that imitated Western modernity and Western colonial modernity, let's say. So the frameworks, either imitated or by force, can be seen in every part of the world in that sense. So this dichotomic relationality, this epistemic and ontological foundations that are based on inferior, superior, good or bad, etc., can be seen and observed in every single society almost. So in that sense, the notion of Tawhid and the claim of the Tawhid, as a not only a theological framework but also as a social and political and proposition, creates this new ground where humans are treated equally regardless of their ethnicity, class, color of the skin, etc., etc. So and that is why it is very critical. And I don't think personally any form of formulations can be seen or observed in other epistemic grounds. So it has its own uniqueness in that sense. So am I following the question that you asked in my answer as much as possible, Matthew?
Um, yeah, I think so. That so the Tawhid is something that yeah, I think you began to answer it. What about this issue of, I guess, how does Tawhid interact with the question of like essentialism or simplification of the identity?
Of course, Tawhid is not a kind of projecting denial of ethnicity or identity, like in the context of like a Marxist sense, ethnicity as a kind of secular or foundation, or ethnicity or cultural forms as uh, as something devaluing them. Of course, the notion of Tawhid is based on the multiplicity of and variety of humans in relation to their history and culture and their authenticity. But it is completely denied with this multiplicity and diversity. The notion of Tawhid is denying and eradicating any form of inferiority or superiority within the epistemic and ontological foundation. So it is closing the doors for any form of proposition, and that is why Ali Shariati is seeing this as a form of shirk, as a theological also reaction to this anomy or this destruction, because it is not denial, or it is not also glorification. It is acceptance of diversity within the humanity without any evolutionist, positivist, or hierarchical, positionality. Tawhid, I think the most critical aspects of the notion of Tawhid is rejection of the hierarchies, either based on epistemic foundations or ontological foundations. It is this claim of any form of hierarchy within the society and the claim that is closing the door for them. So I think this is something that makes the notion of Tawhid something more valuable and more unique for understanding it as a kind of emancipatory tool for decolonization and decolonization of the mind. Because, and in relation to the first part of your question, so Tawhid is as a tool of decolonization becomes a mechanism of healing also of the oppressed or the inferior because of the destruction of the colonial legacy and the creation of this subjects without lack of confidence, without claim of their identity and the self. So the notion of Tawhid in that sense is it's an empowering theological and epistemic foundation that gives power of all discriminated, oppressed, and otherized, individuals, whether in the context of gender, either in the context of the race, either in the context of ethnicity or other um, um, identities within the society.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, one certainly related question, I suppose, but for those of us who are somewhat pedestrians to post-colonial theory, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of maybe some examples, illustrative examples um, of kind of what it means to have, for the colonialization process to affect the self and the uh, um, to have like a Kurdish self, and this be destroyed by a new epistemology. So could you maybe give some kind of details to what it, maybe some examples of what's the epistemology that was lost? What are the, what are the maybe the sources of knowledge or how one sees their place in the world or, could you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, if of course, again, I want to repeat myself in the context of sites of resistance and the coping mechanisms and tactics of the Kurds, how to engage and deal with Kemalist colonial modernist practices. Of course, from the first day, there has been different sites of resistance, either epistemic, either ontological, either social and cultural. Of course, I am I want to make sure that I understood in that way. There is an either on the ground or underground. There has been a continuity of and the making of the Kurdish self through different mediums and mechanisms within the territories in Turkey or outside of the Kurdish territories outside of Turkey as well. But under the social, cultural, political implications of Kemalist colonial modernity, what is lost? First, the idea of the self in terms of an ethnicity. Who am I? So where do I belong to? What is my history? So we grow up. At least I could say my generation and probably generations before me. We grow up with this claim of who we are since high school years. We have been in a fight to convince our Turkish teachers and Turkish doctors and Turkish nurses and Turkish neighbors that we exist. We are not Turkish and we exist. We are a different ethnicity. So this is, and we claim a history. And of course, but this claim of the history was something that we started to investigate and learn in the 1990s when we were undergraduate students at universities. Before that, we were not familiar with who we are. We knew that we are Kurdish. We knew that we are different. We are not Turkish. We were Kurds at home, but we were Turkish at the school. So we grow up with such dilemma or which such a challenge in everyday life since the childhood period. For instance, I learned Turkish at the age of 6, and I was speaking Turkish at the school setting. But even so, the second point is about the language, the claim of the language, that we have a language and our language. So remember, in my presentation, I was talking about this denial of the Kurdish language as an uh, as a language by itself. You know, the claim that there is no such language, it is a mixture of Arabic and Persian and even Turkish, the Mountain Turk. So the denial of the language in the state and official discourses, but in the same time, prohibition of the language in the public spaces. So you were, even during the breaks at the school, you were not allowed to speak even your language. And if you speak, uh, someone will spy on you, or a teacher will see you. And all teachers were Turkish, by the way. So you imagine a school setting that 100% all kids are Kurdish and all teachers are Turkish. And the only way to communicate with your teacher is at age of 7, 6, 7, you start to learn the Turkish, and this is the level of your Turkish is the only medium to communicate with your teacher. So in most of the cases, I remember the kids whose Turkish was not good enough were always having communication problem with the Turkish teachers. And then they will shift to Kurdish, and then beating will start, punishing will start. So it was an everyday practice, even on the streets. So you were not allowed to perform your language on the streets in the public space in most of the periods. So this.
Mamusta Ramazan, I'm sorry to interrupt. In the interest of time, I want to remind you that there are some
Okay.
written questions, so I think we should go with Mehmet Ağ's question. Then Khayal Kartal has been waiting patiently. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Professor Ibrahim Özdemir raised his hand.
Okay.
So these three, if you could answer, I would be grateful. Sorry, Matthew, I felt like I didn't want to interrupt, but yeah, if you could go to the
Okay.
chat. So
Okay.
Mehmet A, and then Mehmet A, and Khayal Kartal,
Okay.
and Ibrahim Özdemir. Thank you.
Yeah, so Mehmet A asked about how the kind of the incoherence of colonial policy that sort of claims that the Kurds don't exist, but at the same time claims the need to colonize them. Could you maybe speak to how that affects society?
Yeah, of course. As I mentioned, in the 20s, it was a complete denial of the existence. But then there was a recognition that okay, they exist, but they need to be civilized. So the civilizing mission was too much in the state hand, and state discourses appear in the 30s and 40s, and even until today. So if you look at the mainstream reaction of the modern Turkish state, that civilizing mission even still, and Orientalist discourses even still continue one way or another today. So yes, it can be seen as an inconsistency, that from the denial and then like a complete rejection first, but then acceptance, but acceptance with a civilizing mission. How do we assimilate them or civilize them through different implementation of different policies? And of course, in that context, I talked about schooling and education. On the other hand, militarization and all other tools were implemented in order to facilitate a complete destruction of the Kurdish self, and transformation of the Kurds into a Turkish self. So assimilation process was operating in that path, I would say, during which Kurdish history, Kurdish memory, Kurdish language, all of them were denied. Denial continued. Even it's ironic to mention, but even today, it is 2026, in the parliament, if one of the parliament members speaks in Kurdish, the secretary of the parliament, they are recording and putting down everything that is spoken within the parliament, in the room, in the hall. It is reported that the parliament members has spoken in an unknown language. So according to mevzuat or whatever principles within the parliament, Kurdish language is not seen as an accepted, language within, according to the current criteria within the parliament even. And of course, those of you who are interested can trace and different stories about that in recent past. Am I clear in my answer, or am I missing something? I can go
I think that
further.
was that Mehmet's question?
Yeah.
Mehmet?
Actually, it was my question, Matthew. Actually, the question is kind of a little bit theoretical. For as a precondition of colonization of a particular nation, you have to accept first their existence. So, if the existence of Kurdish people ontologically and epistemologically is not accepted or recognized, how can you colonize it? And I mean, the condition of the Kurdish people, I think, is the worse than a colonized nation. Am I just like missing something, or my way of logic is taking
No,
me somewhere else actually?
thank you very much. No, well, of course, we are talking about the official discourses. Like official discourses was based on the denial, but in practice, they were killing them. How they can deny them? They were killing in thousands, executing them in thousands. So denial was within the discourse, but in practice, in reality, every single state official knew that they exist and they are different and they are not Turkish. So my point there was about the state discourse, by echoing also Mesut Yan's analysis, good analysis on that direction. But later, the Kemalist colonial modernization process was completely leading to a complete assimilation and destruction of the Kurdish self and Kurdish identity and Kurdish language, etc. So that is why if something doesn't exist, how you can prohibit it, or right? So so at the first, like in the 1920s, the denial was completely like rhetorical or in the discourse, but in practice on the ground, of course, different forms of the violence and terror were implemented to suffocate the population by any means necessary, of course.
Well, as you said, you talked about how they were like these people obviously exist, but they were explained not as being part of another true identity, but as being just like wrong Turks. They're being Turkish in the wrong way or something, or they're failing to be Turkish, right?
Or they exist as inferior entities, or
Okay.
as Mahmoud Bozkurt, this guy, Ministry of Justice, they exist as a slave or as an inferior
Mhm.
population within the mainstream Turkish society, which legacy. I don't see that discourse as a kind of exceptional or like a discourse. I personally see it as a continuation in that discourse even today, unfortunately,
Okay.
in different levels, in different versions.
Okay. Khayal, Qartal wanted to ask something.
Okay.
Yes, hi. Thanks so much for your presentation, Doctor. And thanks so much, as always, to Zahra Institute to open space to discuss difficult questions. My question about first, I recognize Kurdistan as a colonialized state. So we are a nation state, and north of Kurdistan is being colonized by Turkey. The founder leader of Turkey, adopting Western understanding of the worldview, secularization, taught the past, and that was in your presentation, that modernization was a rupture from the past.
Mm-hmm.
But later on, there's a massacre it's a accepted massacre, not really resistance, as an example. But as non-Muslim, we're not following Sunni Muslim pathway. How could such claim apply to Alawi Kurds? I found this a bit interesting. That Alawis are being massacred also during Ottoman Empire. So they've been going through massacres after massacres, actually. The one thing was, one of the main reasons they've been massacred during 1937 through 80s and ongoing assimilation, systematic assimilation, is their national identity, and that is Kurd, right? So not as Muslims that being subjected to, but it was their solely language and identity, national identity. So I found this a bit interesting for you to say that Kemalist secular modernization colonized Kurdistan, and used Darsim as an example that did not really fit. So I wonder how you are thinking of Kurdish Alawis into secularized modernization, assimilation through this tool.
Okay, thank you very much, Khayal. In my doctoral research, which is published as a book, which is titled "The Formation of Kurdishness in Turkey: Political Violence, Fear, and Pain," in 2013, in my that research, I am claiming Kurdishness, the notion of the Kurdishness, as a violated self, as a state of blackness within the Turkish in Turkey. So in that work also, I am defining and claiming Kurdishness regardless of it is class, ethnicity, class, religion, or sectarian, or ideological baggage, because I believe that it doesn't matter whether you are Sunni or whether you are Alawi, whether you are rich or whether you are poor, whether you are an Islamist or whether you are a secular, whether you are a capitalist, educated, not educated Kurd. At the end of the day, I see Kurdishness in Turkey. That was one of my main argument in my work, as a state of blackness in the context of the African Americans in the United States. That my claim, of course, was based on my data and my observations, that regardless of your ideological class, age, education, background, at the end of the day, you are a Kurd. So this is how personally I see the Kemalist colonial modernity also practice. I think the Kemalist colonial modernization project didn't differentiate between the Sunni Muslims or Sunni Kurds or Alawi Kurds or rich or this or that. At the end of the day, your claim of Kurdishness at the end of the day will put in that box of unwanted, that box of backward, that box of terrorist, or that box of like unwanted body. So that is why I don't see any problem by giving references to experiences of different Kurds with different sectarian or ideological or religious background, either Sufi or Islamist or capitalist or ordinary. It doesn't matter. My proposal and my theoretical articulation based on my data and experiences also come to that point that which is too much resonating Fanonian discourse of blackness. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who you are, your class, your education, your church or your sect, whatever. At the end of the day, your skin is black. So Kurdishness, to my personal understanding and based on my scholarship and the previous fieldworks and research, I see Kurdishness within that framework, both theoretical and empirical framework. I see it in that way. That is why I feel more comfortable to put them together into my theoretical articulation. I hope I am clear, Adam.
Professor Ibrahim Özdemir
Okay.
had a question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ramazan, and also Matthew for your moderation, and really you pull up very memoir in my mind as a Kurdish childhood, like you just learned Turkish at school. But I think when we talk about the colonization and also colonization of Kurdistan, I think we have to say something about the social Darwinism, the impact of social Darwinism, because the colonizers, they legitimize their colonization, as the burden of the white man.
Yeah.
And when we look at some of our sincere teachers, Turkish sincere teachers in our region, at our schools, they was just assume it, they are civilizing us. It's a burden for them. They're sacrificing their time, their energy to just teach us Turkish, to just make us to forget our identity, etc. This is the first my question. Maybe you can say something about that. And it is started, as you know, at the late Ottoman time, and even some Ottomans, although Ottoman times was there was a caliphate, etc., etc., but their mentality towards Armenian, towards Greeks, towards Kurds, it was the same. It was, he said it was a burden of us to get rid of them or to civilize them. And the second thing, about the concept of Tawhid, and not only Ali Shariati, the late, Ismail Faruqi says the Tawhid is the essence of Islamic civilization. And Said Nursi says one of the four, aims of the Quran, the first one is Tawhid. And also, Naqib al-Attas, who just passed away 2 months or 3 months ago, he says the same thing. But my problem is that nation-state mentality never, understood Tawhid in this sense.
Yes.
Or even the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and also Islamic Republic of Iran, when we look at their practice, there is no Tawhid in their mentality. I think you maybe say something about that. And what is irony is, one of the major law in the new republic is Tawhid Tadrisat, the law of Tawhid Tadrisat. They also use Tawhid, but in a totally different, context. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. First of all, of course, when you look at the ideology and the practices of Ittihad and Taraqi, unity and progress movement, Turkish nationalism was one of the basis of their epistemic foundation. So that is why in their practices and in their practices of performing the Turkish nationalism, actually, which later triggered other nationalisms like Armenian, Arab nationalism, and lastly, Kurdish nationalism as well. Selim Deringil, in one of his work, one of this Turkish Ottoman historian, Selim Deringil, talks about, for the late Ottoman period, as far as I remember, he was talking about borrowed colonialism, that how colonialism was borrowed and different forms of epistemic and ontological colonialism were implemented in the late Ottoman period in their relationship with other ethnic communities within the Ottoman territories. And of course, you are right. So it is not something that we can just start in a sharp definition with the 1923. There is a continuity and discontinuity from late Ottoman period until today. Even you need to trace different patterns and how it evolved, of course. But Kemalist colonial modernity, with the implementation of the laïcité and the secular politics, Ibrahim Bey becomes something more and more traumatic, not only for the Kurds, but for the all pious and religious population in Turkey, including, of course, Turks and other ethnic groups as well. So the authoritarian secular politics, along with the nationalism, social Darwinism, positivism, ended up with this civilizing mission to assimilate the Kurdish body and the Kurdish self, and in that way integrate into Turkify and integrate into the mainstream population. I talked about this demographic shifts, deportations, demographic engineering projects, etc., etc., and the language issue and all other stuff. So there is this civilizing mission was one of the main pillar of the Kemalist colonial modernist projects, during which the Kurdish body and the Kurdish self was too much affected and traumatized in that sense. And in your second, and of course, this civilizing mission was not only framed within the social Darwinism, like the Kurd or the Kurdish self, something that is evolving, something that is progressing, something that is becoming. It was also biological. So there was it is not like, even it is like a epidermization of the Kurdishness in that sense. Racial discrimination was epidermized, what Frantz Fanon talks about in the context of the skin color. So the skin color or other biological things were associated with the Kurdish body. One of the famous biological Darwinist discourse within the Kemalist narrative is the Kurds with tail. And in my book, The Formation of Kurdishness, I am giving reference to one of the former Kurdish parliament member, Orhan Doğan, where in one of the reportage, he's talking about one of his memory somewhere in the Aegean region, where his father was a civil servant, a memur, devlet memuru, Aydın or Manisa, somewhere there, as far as I remember. And Orhan Doğan is going to, this is a Kurdish former party, he passed away long time ago, from Cizre, Şırnak. He's like in his teenage years, he's going to school and secondary or high school. And after a while, one day, he recognizes that some of his classmates are checking, removing his jacket and looking his back. And of course, he thinks there's like a kind of sexual abuse or something, like intervention. Say, what are you doing? Why you are trying to look at my back? And then the kids are asking, we are curious, where is your tail? So this is not like a caricature or this example. This is like a lived experience. And this was how, I don't know, but I in my presentation, I mentioned some of the columnists in Cumhuriyet Gazetesi. There are a lot of Darwinists, like a biological Darwinist kind of racist, discriminatory terminology and adjectives that they use for the Kurds on their webpage. So it is not only social Darwinistic approach to assimilate and to transform the Kurdish self and the Kurdish body. It was also a biological Darwinist, conception, unfortunately, in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And it wasn't only in the Aegean. I heard from some other Turkish friends that this kind of rumor and gossip was popular, like in the East and in the Central Anatolian cities as well. So that is why civilizing. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we're running out of time. I think Mehmet Asute had a question as well.
Yeah, quickly, the second question, the nation state point. Yes, unfortunately, I have been discussing this in other parts. That is why I want to talk about different impacts of internal colonialism within the Muslim majority countries, not only in the context of the Kurds, but in the context of other ethnic minorities. Iran, for instance, is one of the good example of this, of course, or Syria, etc. Modern nation, like the claim of the Islamicate or Islamic State in the context of Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Iran, etc., unfortunately didn't work in that way, and the claim of Islamic State transformed into cliche modern nation state based on one ethnicity, one identity, one history, one memory, in which and during which, unfortunately, Iran is one of good example for this. The claim of the Islamic State didn't work and operate in practice, and the state transformed into a cliche modern nation state where non-Persian ethnic communities have been suffering, Turks, Kurds, and Baluchs for a long time, unfortunately. Yes, hocam, buyurun.
Okay, Assalamualaikum, hocam. It's just great to hear the Tawhidi proposition on solving the Kurdish problem, but I'm really excited with the idea because I work on Islamic moral economy, a counter-hegemonic position against capitalism, and therefore Tawhid is very much central to my argument as well as the work that I do. But the problem you and me are facing, the social formation that we have around us, in my case, the society together with economy, in your case, society with ethnicities, has been grafted in such a way that we do not have a common language of Tawhid to communicate with. The nation state, Ibrahim Hoja referred to nation state. I don't think even we are not in that level, in the ordinary people level, in the mosque, on the streets, in the Muslim world, not only in Turkey or problematic areas of the Kurds, Arabs, Iranians, and Turkey, but it's beyond that. The articulation of Tawhid in everyday life is just is a spoken vernacular, but it is not articulated in everyday life and everyday practice. So when we do not have this commonality, a language, a vernacular of Islam dominating and producing a social formation, how we are going to, this is a question I'm raising for myself as well as to you, how we are going to solve the problem with Tawhid, because master signifier remains the nation state. It remains dominating everything. And strangely, in the last 20 years in the Muslim world, with the increased religiosity, the dominant nationalism has increased as well. When Republicans were dominant in Turkey, you didn't have flags in the mosque. Now you have flags in the mosque. To that extent, even questioning that, you wouldn't be able to question why this flag is in the mosque. In other words, when you have these distinctions, we fall into this same problem as the secular Kurds. Abdullah Öcalan talks about democratic democratic state in which all the nations, ethnicities can exist. I mean, you do not have such a social formation in a very radical democracy manner. The Kurds or other ethnicities to be able to express themselves as the Tawhidi meaning in our case, in your and my case. So when you do not have it, I mean, in the UK, I'm based in the UK, that environment exists, and therefore Scots have parliaments. The Welsh can have a smaller version of that parliament with language, education in their language, the Irish and etc. But when you do not have that, and when everyone is around very much the territoriality and ethnicity, and every claim is considered, even the Islamic claim is considered against that territoriality, how we are going to move? I mean, my position is the Ihsani governance, that Tawhid supported by a virtue ethics producing an Ihsani governance, allowing existence and the opportunity spaces for everyone to have access to resources and to identify themselves as they are. But we remain very hypothetical, and the problem is on the ground. My problem is that resources are captured by the dominant capitalism. In your case, it is the hegemonic power will not allow speaking of the Kurdish language in the schools. So we are stuck. How we are going to move? It's very much the problem.
Thank you very much.
The ground. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Hojam. Thank you very much for the comments and question. Yeah, first of all, I might sound utopist, of course.
Well,
and
everyone tells me that I'm an utopian as well, so don't worry.
Yeah, but I think, Hojam, this is something that I'm always highlighting and emphasizing in my classes of social theory, anthropology of Islam, and other courses as well with my students at Ibn Haldun University. We are talking about a state of awareness. So first, to what extent are we aware of diverse forms of implications of colonization, Orientalism on our epistemic and ontological bodies? So we need a process of awareness to learn together, to teach together, and to talk to each other about what Ismail Raji Faruqi called malaise. What is the problem, right? So, and I think we are in that stage that we need to talk and we need to address and document what happened and how it has happened and what is the problem. So, secondly, I see the notion of Tawhid not only for the oppressed or the marginalized. I see the notion of Tawhid as a proposal, as a healing mechanism for the oppressed also. Because at the end of the day, the oppressor also is in trouble. So it is not only about the claim of the oppressed or colonized, about his or its rights, about its dignity, and about its self claim and independence. It is like a mutual dialogical framework here, and I think the notion of Tawhid, in that sense, like to echo Frantz Fanon is asking for the killing, and Jean-Paul Sartre in the preface has emphasized this in the book. With the notion of Tawhid, we are inviting both the oppressor and the oppressed to come to that acknowledgement of unity of mankind, even beyond the boundaries of the Islamic or the Muslim societies. So this is something. That you can ask in the context of the slavery and the racism in the United States, for instance. What is the solution for Black Lives Matter? It has been long time ago that the claim that slavery has ended, but the problem is still continuing. It is within the structure, it is within the system, and how to deal with this, how to cope with this. So the first stage is awareness about the level of destruction that that colonial modernity, and in the Kurdish case, that has created psychological, cultural, economic. So an awareness not only for the Kurds themselves, it is an awareness for all parties. For the Turkish side, we need to acknowledge and document how the destruction, the level of the destruction, and multiplicity of the destruction on the epistemic and ontological body. And the second, the invitation to the Tawhid for anyone, for everyone. So I think this is the key point in the proposal that we need to emphasize more and more and more, rather than falling into one of the colonial traps or modernist traps or ethnocentric, ethno-nationalistic, let's say, traps in relation to territoriality or nation-state idea, and etc., etc. All those claims are completely reproduction of the colonial frameworks and Eurocentric frameworks. So we need to address multiplicity of the destruction, Hocam. And in the second part, the invitation is for all parties. And I think this is just something. Just recently, I was visiting Hrant Dink Memorial Site in Shishli, and again, I in one of the short clips in the reportage that was made with him, he is saying that we are Turkish Armenians and the Turkish society, both sides are problematic. Both sides are sick, actually. So the way in which Armenians look at the Turkish side and the ways in which Turkish side look at the Armenian side, and Hrant Dink is claiming that we both are sick and we need healing. So in that sense, the notion of Tawhid is a proposal for everyone. So those who violate, those who destroy, those who also discriminate against, I think, even they are in more need of the oppressed to the notion of Tawhid to recognize. Hocam, this is something that we need to work on it without any feelings of giving up or any feelings of despair and hopelessness. I know I completely understand your position and your feelings, which Ibrahim Özdemir also somehow mentioned earlier in his comment and question. This is something that we need to, personally, myself as a Muslim Kurdish sociologist and anthropologist, I want to emphasize that we need to stick onto that ground and go beyond even our cases, the case here, the Kurdish-Turkish case, and to talk about the notion of Tawhid. In today's context, we are moving towards a world which full of hate, which full of massacres, which full of genocidal massacres from Latin America to Palestine, from Palestine to the Far East. So we are also in the same time global citizens. We live in this dunya. So we need to come up with an alternative vocabulary, an alternative solution. And in this context, the notion of Tawhid, unity of mankind, and which proposes destruction and erasure of any form of hierarchies within the society. We need to stick to this idea and repeat our proposal by more articulations, an invitation for more dialogue for post-colonial thinkers from the South, from Latin America, from the Muslim world, and to continue to the struggle. Personally, I have such a strict and not desiring to give up with this labor. I know it is very tough to convince um, um, um, the other, to convince the colonized mindset about the destruction that has been made, not only in the historical process, but in the current process. I'm working on the emotions, Hojam, and in relation to even emotions, if you talk about and think about this issue, there is too much destruction within the society. So we are living in today's context in 2026, and unfortunately we are still dealing and engaging with simple, quote unquote, very simple claims, to be acknowledged and to be recognized by the other. But this claim and this acknowledgement is not in a position of superior position. We have to also emphasize that what we call in Turkish, we don't do this in the form of like a minnet duymak. This is an epistemic and ontological and God-given, positionality that you are claiming it. So this is not demanding the right, it is claiming the rights and who you are. So that is why we need to talk more, we need to discuss more, and we need to talk about psychological, emotional, economic, political, cultural, historical aspects of the whole question. So there is a long way to go, of course. This is a continuing labor, and I don't think we have a luxury also to give up. I see it personally as a mission also, beyond my academic position. This is an ongoing struggle as a Muslim, as a Kurd, that I am personally engaging with it, and I am continuing with it. And I think to come back to my starting point, we need to talk, we need to voice, we need to repeat and repeat and document the destruction, the level of the destruction that has been done and that has been continuing, and in order to let the other to come to a certain level to listen us. So this is, I'm teaching oral history also. We are
Thank you so
telling,
much, Dr. Aras. I think we have to wrap it up there.
yeah,
But
just final
inshallah,
point. We
okay.
are telling a story, but we need to make sure that our interlocutors, our um, people around us are ready to listen to us also. So there is a need for a dialogical relationality between us and the other in order to come up with a particular healing mechanism and solution, not only in the context of the Kurdish case, but beyond that for the humanity, for everyone. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. It is indeed an ongoing struggle, and that will go on, and we hope to continue continue networking with each other and discussing this problem, these issues, and God willing, work together toward a solution. All of us, all of us equal under Tawhid. And don't miss our next speaker, the next speaker series coming up on the 20th, Wednesday, May 20th. That's Muslim Chaplaincy in America Today, a critical Muslim studies featuring panel of Nora Zeki Mantas of Dominican University and Jay Starr, Association of Muslim Chaplains. So I think, yeah, we'll be wrapping it up there. Don't miss that next talk. And Dr. Aras, thank you so much for your time with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I am very glad and honored to be with you, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Ramazan. Glad to see you.